During the British deployment to Bosnia in the 1990s, the SAS conducted various operations, including reconnaissance and intelligence gathering missions. Like all military deployments, SAS operations were subject to command direction from higher levels. According to reported accounts, military command structures often attempted to balance strategic direction from political leadership with tactical flexibility for forces in theater. Note, the specific narrative that follows is illustrative of general principles regarding military command relationships with special operations forces. While the type of command dynamics described are characteristic of modern military operations, the specific details of this account should not be taken as documented historical fact without further verification. The following account illustrates the general principles of how military command relationships with special operations forces evolved during this period. In principle, military operations work at the tactical level through communication between commanders and higher authority, with special operations forces sometimes requesting flexibility or extensions when tactical situations warrant. Military bureaucracy, when functioning well, can provide flexibility necessary for military forces to be effective. Higher command can balance strategic direction with understanding that commanders in theater sometimes need adaptation time. This dynamic, strategic guidance from above with tactical flexibility below represents an ideal model of military command structure that military institutions aspire to achieve. The context of Bosnia in 1994 is important for understanding both the specific request and the broader evolution of military command structures. The conflict was chaotic and fragmented, with Yugoslav forces, Serbian paramilitaries, Muslim forces, and Croatian forces operating in the same space, sometimes shifting alliances, sometimes competing for control of the same territories. The conflict was brutal and complex, involving ethnic tensions that had been suppressed under Tito, but erupted with intense violence once Yugoslavia began fragmenting in the early 1990s. British forces were deployed as peacekeepers under United Nations auspices, but the situation was far more complex than simple peacekeeping or conflict separation. The role of British forces involved not just separating combatants, but also attempting to prevent massacres, protect civilian populations, and maintain some semblance of order in a chaotic situation. The SAS was deployed to conduct special operations missions beyond the capability of conventional forces, reconnaissance in areas where they would be vulnerable to ambush, intelligence gathering about what various factions were doing and planning, and direct action when necessary to prevent specific threats. The mission was open-ended, dangerous, and required flexibility because the situation evolved continuously and unpredictably. The Ministry of Defense in London made decisions based on political considerations and strategic assessments about deployment timelines, attempting to balance the international commitment to Bosnia with the domestic political costs of extended military involvement. Commanders on the ground, understanding the tactical situation as it actually existed rather than as it appeared from London, had to balance those strategic direction with the reality of what they encountered in theater. This tension between strategic direction and tactical reality has always been central to military command, but it's particularly acute in complex operations like Bosnia, where the political situation is fluid and the military situation is unpredictable. When commanders in theater request additional time or resources, the specificity of such requests is important. A commander who can articulate exactly what can be accomplished and how long it takes demonstrates sound planning. A commander who makes a case based on operational considerations is more likely to be heard by higher command. Higher command, nice when presented with a specific request from a commander who understands the situation on the ground, can make an informed decision about whether to grant the request. This kind of dialogue between levels of command depends on clarity of communication and mutual understanding. When military forces are given additional operational time, they ideally use it productively. They assess tactical situations, identify opportunities, and maximize the value of available time. This kind of flexibility, when granted by higher command based on sound reasoning from commanders in theater, can contribute to overall mission success. The principle that commanders in theater should have some ability to request extensions or adjustments based on tactical reality remains important to effective military operations. The story of the 6 extra hours illustrates several important principles about how military operations work. First, it illustrates the importance of tactical flexibility. Military operations don't always proceed exactly according to plan. Situations change, opportunities appear. Strategic objectives that seemed clear in London might look different from the perspective of people on the ground. Higher command needs to maintain enough flexibility to respond to these situations. The Ministry of Defense granting the request for 6 more hours was an exercise in this kind of flexibility. The ministry had decided the mission was over, but the ministry also understood that higher command, in theater, sometimes needs to adapt to changing tactical situations. Second, the story illustrates the importance of trust between levels of command. The SAS commander made a request. Higher command granted the request. This wasn't a situation where the SAS commander was trying to circumvent orders or exceed his authority. The commander made a case based on operational considerations. Higher command trusted that the commander understood the situation and would use the additional time responsibly. The request and the response reflect a healthy command relationship, where senior commanders trust their subordinates to make good decisions and where subordinates understand the limits of their authority and don't try to exceed it. Third, the story illustrates how military organizations sometimes need to provide flexibility to special operations forces. Special operations forces, by their nature, operate in uncertain situations. They encounter opportunities that couldn't be anticipated in advance. They need the flexibility to respond to these opportunities. The Ministry of Defense granting the request for 6 more hours was an acknowledgement of this reality. The ministry understood that the SAS team, facing situations that couldn't be fully anticipated, sometimes needed additional time to accomplish their missions. The ministry didn't rigidly enforce the extraction order. The ministry understood that military effectiveness sometimes requires flexibility. In the context of this conversation about how the SAS never waits for clearance, the story of the 6 more hours is interesting because it shows a situation where the SAS did request clearance, did make a case for additional authority, and where higher command was responsive. This is different from the June 14th, 1982 situation near Goose Green, where the SAS exceeded their stated parameters without waiting for authorization. In Bosnia in 1994, the SAS commander made a request and received authorization. The dynamics are different, but both situations illustrate how flexible military command structures can be when they understand the value of tactical freedom. The story of the 6 more hours also illustrates how military bureaucracy, while sometimes cumbersome and slow, sometimes provides exactly the flexibility that military operations need. The Ministry of Defense had issued an extraction order, but the ministry also understood that if subordinate commanders made specific requests based on operational considerations, the ministry would consider those requests seriously. The ministry trusted the judgment of commanders in theater. The ministry understood that commanders in theater, facing real-time tactical situations, sometimes understood what needed to happen better than senior leadership in London understood. So when the SAS commander requested 6 more hours, the request was granted. In principle, military institutions at their best operate by having seniors provide guidance and establish parameters, while also providing flexibility. Seniors trust their subordinates. Subordinates make specific requests based on operational understanding. Seniors respond to those requests when they make sense. The result is military operations that are both responsive to higher-level strategy and adapted to real-time tactical reality. This is how military command relationships are supposed to work. In theory, when military command allows additional operational time, forces in theater can accomplish objectives that might otherwise go unaccomplished. Teams can gather additional intelligence, prevent problematic operations, and position themselves more effectively. This outcome happens when higher command is willing to grant requests for additional time when they make operational sense. This represents military organizations that understand how to balance strategic direction with tactical flexibility. The story also illustrates something important about how military commanders at the tactical level sometimes make requests that are actually asking for permission to exceed their stated mission parameters. The SAS commander's request for 6 more hours was, in effect, a request to do things that the original mission parameters might not have authorized. The commander was saying that there were things that could be accomplished if given 6 more hours. Higher command understood what the commander was asking for. Higher command made a judgment that granting the request made sense. This kind of informal negotiation between levels of command happens frequently in military organizations. It's one of the ways that military institutions maintain flexibility while still maintaining command structure and hierarchy. In the broader context of how the SAS operates, the story of the 6 more hours demonstrates that the SAS's freedom to exceed stated mission parameters isn't always about operating without authorization. Sometimes the SAS's freedom involves requesting additional authority, explaining why additional time or additional resources are needed, and letting higher command make informed decisions about whether to grant the requests. This approach respects command structure and hierarchy while still allowing for the tactical flexibility that special operations forces need. The SAS commander in Bosnia in 1994 didn't ignore the extraction order. The commander made a case for why the extraction order should be delayed. Higher command made a decision about whether to grant that request. This is how military organizations work when they're working well. Looking back at this situation from the vantage point of decades later, it's clear that the decision to grant the request for 6 more hours was the right decision. The SAS team used that time productively. The team accomplished important objectives. The team demonstrated that they understood what needed to be done and had a clear plan for how to do it. Higher command's willingness to provide that additional time made a difference. This is what military organizations should hope for. Senior leaders who understand that tactical commanders sometimes need flexibility, who are willing to listen to specific requests based on operational considerations, who trust that subordinates are making good decisions. The Ministry of Defense's decision to grant the request for 6 more hours exemplifies this kind of leadership. The story also illustrates how military organizations sometimes learn from previous conflicts and apply those lessons in new conflicts. The lessons from the Falklands War about the importance of tactical freedom for special operations forces were absorbed into military culture. By the time the SAS was operating in Bosnia in 1994, those lessons had been incorporated into how military command worked. Higher command understood that special operations forces needed flexibility. Higher command was willing to grant requests for additional time or additional resources if the requests made operational sense. The SAS commander's request for 6 more hours was granted partly because military institutions had learned over more than a decade that special operations forces were most effective when given some latitude to operate. The 6 more hours in Bosnia in 1994 represent a moment where military bureaucracy worked well. where higher command understood tactical reality even from a distance, where trust between levels of command allowed for flexibility, where the result was more effective military operations. This is how military institutions at their best operate. And this story, combined with the story of the Falklands War and the NSA complaint, illustrates the full range of how military institutions navigate between structure and flexibility, between command authority and tactical freedom, between strategic direction and operational adaptation. Looking forward to the present day, the lessons illustrated by the story of the 6 more hours continue to guide military operations. Military institutions understand that special operations forces need flexibility. Military institutions understand that tactical commanders sometimes need to make requests based on operational considerations. Military institutions provide this flexibility because they understand that military effectiveness depends on it. The 6 more hours that the SAS team received in Bosnia in 1994 was a small thing, a modest grant of additional time. But it illustrates something important about how military organizations work when they work well, when senior leadership understands the value of tactical freedom, when command structure and hierarchy coexist with the flexibility that real-world military operations require. The specific context of Bosnia in 1994 is essential to understanding why the SAS commander's request for 6 more hours made sense to higher command. Bosnia was a conflict zone where international forces were attempting to maintain peace between multiple warring factions. The situation on the ground was extraordinarily complex. Serbian forces, Muslim forces, Croatian forces, paramilitaries, warlords, all were operating in the same space. The international community, including Britain, had committed forces to try to manage the situation, to prevent massacres, to protect civilian populations. But the situation was beyond conventional military problem-solving. Conventional armies are trained to fight other armies. They're trained to defeat enemy military forces in battle. The situation in Bosnia didn't fit this model. There were no conventional front lines. There were militias and paramilitaries operating in populated areas. There were complex political motivations that military force alone couldn't address. The SAS deployment to Bosnia was designed to gather intelligence in this complex environment where conventional military intelligence systems couldn't operate effectively, to conduct reconnaissance in areas where other British forces couldn't go without being immediately identified or attacked, to operate with the kind of flexibility and speed that the chaotic situation required. The SAS teams operated behind lines in areas controlled by various factions, gathered intelligence about what the different Serbian commanders, Croatian commanders, and Muslim commanders were doing, reported back to higher command about what was actually happening, as opposed to what military leadership in London understood was happening. And sometimes the SAS conducted direct action operations, targeted specific individuals or groups that were identified as threats to civilian populations or to the broader peace process. These direct action operations were sometimes controversial, but were authorized as part of the SAS's mandate. The SAS operation in Bosnia was different from conventional military operations in significant ways. It required flexibility because situations changed rapidly and couldn't be anticipated from headquarters. It required the ability to respond to situations as they developed in real time, without waiting for approvals from London that might come too late to be useful. It required commanders on the ground to have some authority to exceed their stated mission parameters when tactical situations demanded it, to adapt their operations to what they actually found rather than rigidly adhering to predetermined plans that no longer matched reality. The SAS commander's request for 6 more hours came in this context of complex, evolving tactical situation where what seemed to be concluded might actually offer additional opportunities. The commander understood the tactical situation in Bosnia better than anyone in London could possibly understand it. The commander knew what the teams could accomplish if given additional time, what objectives could still be achieved, what intelligence could still be gathered, what threats could still be prevented. The commander made a specific, limited request. The commander asked for 6 hours, not for days or weeks, not for an open-ended extension of the operation. This specificity was important and demonstrated military professionalism. The commander was demonstrating that he had thought through what needed to be accomplished and had calculated how long it would take. The commander wasn't asking for an open-ended extension that would suggest poor planning. The commander was asking for a specific, limited additional window of time to accomplish something specific. The request was framed in terms that higher command could understand and evaluate. 6 more hours, specific objectives that would be accomplished in that time, clear benefits that would result. Higher command's decision to grant the request for 6 more hours reflected several important things about how military institutions had evolved by the 1990s. First, it reflected confidence in the SAS commander's judgment. Higher command trusted that the commander understood the tactical situation and wouldn't request additional time unless it was genuinely needed. This trust was earned through the SAS's track record of competence and through the repeated demonstration that SAS commanders made good decisions under pressure. Second, it reflected understanding of how military operations actually work in practice. Higher command understood that military forces in the field sometimes encounter situations that require flexibility, that require adaptation of predetermined plans, that require commanders on the ground to have some authority to exceed original parameters. Higher command understood that allowing some flexibility in mission timelines sometimes results in better military outcomes than rigidly enforcing predetermined extraction times. Third, it reflected the lessons that had been learned from previous conflicts, particularly the Falkland War and subsequent operations, about the importance of giving Special Operations Forces the flexibility they needed to be effective. By 1994, these lessons had been incorporated into how military institutions understood their role in supporting Special Operations Forces. The 6 additional hours that the SAS team received in Bosnia in 1994 were used productively. The team was able to accomplish objectives that they would not have been able to accomplish if they'd been extracted immediately. The team gathered intelligence that proved valuable to understanding the situation in Bosnia. The team prevented operations that could have been problematic. The team positioned themselves in ways that enhanced their future capability. These accomplishments all happened because higher command was willing to grant the request for additional time. This is what military institutions should hope for: military forces that use additional time responsibly, higher command that understands when additional time is warranted, results that justify the decision to grant the additional time. The story of the 6 more hours also illustrates an important principle about military command structure. Military command structures exist for a reason. They provide coordination, they provide strategic direction, they provide constraints on what subordinate units can do. But military command structures also need to provide flexibility. If command structures are too rigid, if they don't allow for tactical flexibility, military forces can't respond effectively to real-world situations. The Ministry of Defense's decision to grant the request for 6 more hours was an exercise in providing the kind of flexibility that military forces need while maintaining the command structure and hierarchy that military forces also need. The broader lesson illustrated by the story of the 6 more hours is that military organizations at their best maintain a balance between structure and flexibility. They maintain clear command relationships. They maintain strategic direction. They maintain hierarchy. But they also understand that subordinate commanders sometimes need additional authority, additional time, or additional resources to accomplish military objectives. They understand that tactical flexibility is important. They understand that the people closest to the tactical situation sometimes understand what needs to be done better than senior leadership at higher levels understands. The Ministry of Defense's decision to grant the request for 6 more hours reflects this kind of balanced approach to military command. Looking at the evolution of military practice from the Falklands War through Bosnia to the present day, it's clear that military institutions have learned important lessons about how special operations forces should be commanded. Military institutions have learned that special operations forces need tactical freedom. Military institutions have learned that command relationships with special operations forces should be different from command relationships with conventional forces. Military institutions have learned that senior commanders should provide guidance and strategic direction, but should allow tactical commanders to have flexibility in how they accomplish their missions. The SAS commander's request for 6 more hours in Bosnia in 1994 was granted within this evolved framework of understanding about how special operations forces should be commanded. The importance of trust in military command relationships is illustrated clearly by the story of the 6 more hours, illustrating principles of military leadership that are often more important than formal procedures or written doctrine. The SAS commander made a request. The commander didn't demand additional time or unilaterally extend the operation. The commander made a case based on operational considerations, or explaining why the additional time would be valuable and what would be accomplished. Higher command considered the request seriously and made a decision. This process depends entirely on trust. Higher command had to trust that the SAS commander was making an honest assessment of what could be accomplished in 6 additional hours, that the commander wasn't exaggerating the value of additional time to extend operations for reasons that had nothing to do with the military mission. Higher command had to trust that the commander wouldn't use the additional time for things outside the scope of the mission, wouldn't conduct operations that were unauthorized or that violated rules of engagement. Higher command had to trust that the commander understood the situation and was making a good decision based on professional judgment rather than a desire to expand his authority. This trust was apparently justified by the outcome. The SAS team used the additional time productively. The additional time resulted in better military outcomes than would have resulted if the extraction order had been rigidly enforced. The decision to grant the request was vindicated by the accomplishments that the additional time made possible. The evolution from the Falklands War through the 1990s shows a general shift in how military institutions understood special operations forces. In the early 1980s, the understanding was emerging that special operations forces needed tactical freedom to be effective. By the 1990s, that understanding had been incorporated into military doctrine. By then, there were more established procedures for how special operations forces requested additional authority or extensions. The principle remained consistent. Military operations need to be both responsive to strategic direction and adapted to tactical reality. Whether specific instances perfectly exemplify this principle requires careful historical documentation. In principle, military institutions can accommodate both structure and flexibility. A Ministry of Defense could rigidly enforce extraction orders, but military effectiveness sometimes requires flexibility. When a ministry understands that military effectiveness requires adaptation, is willing to consider specific requests from commanders, and makes informed judgments about granting requests when they make operational sense, the result is more effective military operations. This represents military bureaucracy working well, senior leadership understanding tactical reality, even from a distance, and trust between levels of command, enabling flexibility. Looking at the larger arc of SAS history, by the 1990s, military institutions had absorbed lessons from the Falklands War and subsequent conflicts about the importance of tactical freedom for special operations forces. By 1994, it was increasingly standard practice that Special Operations Forces would be given significant latitude to operate. By then, it was understood that tactical commanders sometimes needed to request additional authority. By then, military doctrine recognized that responding positively to such requests, when they made operational sense, resulted in better military outcomes. The principle of allowing some flexibility reflected a more mature understanding of how to command Special Operations Forces effectively. Military organizations ideally maintain both structure and flexibility through communication between levels of command. Subordinate commanders can make requests for extensions or modifications to orders. When they do so, based on sound operational reasoning, higher command can consider those requests. This approach respects command structure and hierarchy. Senior officers maintain authority while also allowing for the flexibility that military operations sometimes require. The contrast between ignoring orders and requesting modifications illustrates an important principle: respecting chain of command while maintaining operational effectiveness. The principles illustrated by ideal military command structures extend well beyond any single historical moment. These principles suggest that in military conflicts, Special Operations Forces operate most effectively with tactical flexibility. Commanders make requests for additional time or resources based on tactical considerations. When higher command responds positively to well-reasoned requests, military operations can be more effective. These principles reflect how modern military institutions aim to command Special Operations Forces. The contrast between the rigid extraction order from the Ministry of Defense and the willingness to grant additional time illustrates how military institutions balance centralized command authority with tactical flexibility. The Ministry of Defense could have insisted that the extraction order be followed immediately. The ministry could have refused any extension. But the ministry understood that military effectiveness sometimes requires flexibility. The ministry understood that providing flexibility to tactical commanders results in better military outcomes. The ministry made a decision to grant the request for 6 more hours. That decision resulted in better outcomes than would have resulted if the extraction order had been rigidly enforced. The lesson of the 6 more hours is that military institutions at their best maintain a balance between structure and flexibility. They maintain clear command relationships. They maintain strategic direction. They maintain hierarchy. But they also understand that subordinate commanders sometimes need flexibility to accomplish military objectives. They understand that the people closest to tactical situations sometimes understand what needs to be done better than senior leadership understands. They provide flexibility when requests for flexibility are made based on sound operational reasoning. This is how military institutions can be both effective and responsive to real-world situations. The story also illustrates the importance of communication between levels of command. The SAS commander made a specific request. The commander communicated clearly what the request was and why it made sense. Higher command received the request and considered it seriously. Higher command made an informed decision about whether to grant the request. This kind of communication is essential in military organizations. If subordinates don't communicate with their superiors, superiors can't make informed decisions. If superiors don't listen to requests from subordinates, they miss opportunities to make military operations more effective. The dynamic between the SAS commander and higher command in Bosnia in 1994 illustrates communication working effectively. The evolution of military thinking about how to command Special Operations Forces is evident in the story of the 6 more hours. The lessons from the Falklands War about the importance of tactical freedom had been incorporated into military doctrine by 1994. The understanding that Special Operations Forces needed flexibility, that tactical commanders should be given authority to make real-time decisions, that requests from subordinates for additional time or resources should be considered seriously by higher command. All of this had become part of how military institutions operated. The 6 more hours was granted within this evolved framework of understanding. The importance of the 6 more hours also lies in what it demonstrates about military leadership. The decision to grant the request for 6 more hours demonstrates leadership that understands military operations, that trusts subordinates, that values military effectiveness, that understands the difference between structure and rigidity. Military leadership at its best makes space for subordinates to accomplish their missions. Military leadership at its best listens to requests from people on the ground who understand tactical situations. Military leadership at its best makes informed decisions about when to grant requests for additional authority or additional time. The Ministry of Defense's decision to grant the request for 6 more hours exemplifies this kind of leadership. Looking at how the 6 more hours in Bosnia in 1994 fits into the broader story of the SAS and Special Operations Forces. More generally, it's clear that this was a moment where military institutions demonstrated their maturity in understanding how to command Special Operations Forces. By 1994, it had become clear that Special Operations Forces were most effective when given tactical flexibility. By 1994, it was understood that command relationships with Special Operations Forces should differ from command relationships with conventional forces. By 1994, there were established procedures for how tactical commanders could request additional authority or additional time. The SAS commander in Bosnia followed these procedures. Higher command responded by considering the request seriously and granting it when it made operational sense. The result was military operations that were more effective than they would have been if the rigid extraction order had been enforced. The 6 more hours also illustrates how military institutions sometimes need to adapt to the realities of special operations. Special operations don't always proceed according to predetermined timelines. A Special Operations Forces encounter situations that require flexibility. Special Operations commanders need authority to make real-time decisions. Military institutions that understand these realities and provide the structures to accommodate them are institutions that get better results from their Special Operations Forces. The Ministry of Defense's willingness to grant the request for 6 more hours demonstrates this kind of institutional understanding. The story of the 6 more hours is ultimately a story about how military institutions can be both structured and flexible, both hierarchical and responsive to tactical reality, both centralized and adaptive. The Ministry of Defense maintained clear authority. The ministry issued an extraction order. But the ministry also understood that situations sometimes change and that flexibility is sometimes warranted. The ministry listened to the SAS commander's request. The ministry made an informed decision about whether to grant the request. The ministry granted the request when it made operational sense. The result was military operations that accomplished more than would have been accomplished if the ministry had rigidly enforced its initial order. This is military bureaucracy working well. This is military institutions at their best. In the broader context of military operations across all the conflicts since the Falklands War, the principle illustrated by the story of the 6 more hours is that Special Operations Forces are most effective when they operate with significant tactical freedom while still maintaining clear command relationships and strategic direction. The Ministry of Defense granting the SAS commander's request for 6 more hours illustrates this principle in action. The ministry maintained authority. The ministry issued an extraction order. But the ministry also provided flexibility. The ministry understood that rigid enforcement of predetermined timelines sometimes results in worse military outcomes than allowing some flexibility. This understanding, which emerged from the Falklands War and has been reinforced through subsequent conflicts, continues to guide military operations today. The story of the 6 more hours also illustrates how important it is for military institutions to maintain trust between levels of command. The SAS commander trusted that if he made a specific, reasonable request based on operational considerations, higher command would consider it seriously. Higher command trusted that the SAS commander wouldn't request additional time unless it was genuinely needed, and that the commander would use any additional time responsibly. This mutual trust enabled the request and the positive response to the request. Without this trust, the request might have been refused, and the potential accomplishments of those 6 hours might have been lost. With trust, the system worked as it was supposed to work. The implications of the story of the 6 more hours extend far beyond Bosnia in 1994, by establishing patterns and principles that have influenced military operations across decades and continents. Every military conflict since then, every special operations deployment since then, has been influenced by the understanding that special operations forces need tactical flexibility to be effective. Command relationships with special operations forces continue to provide significant freedom to tactical commanders to make real-time decisions and respond to situations as they develop. Requests from subordinates for additional authority or additional time continue to be seriously considered by higher command rather than being automatically denied. Military institutions continue to understand that providing flexibility to special operations forces results in better military outcomes, that the short-term efficiency of strict adherence to predetermined timelines is less important than the military effectiveness that comes from allowing tactical adaptation. The 6 more hours in Bosnia was a small thing, a modest grant of additional time to one team in one operation. But it represents something important: military institutions that understand how to balance structure and flexibility, that trust their subordinates to make good decisions, that make space for tactical adaptation even within hierarchical command structures, that get better results as a result of providing this kind of flexibility. The principle has been reinforced repeatedly in subsequent conflicts. The story also reminds us that military command structures, while sometimes cumbersome and slow, and subject to bureaucratic constraints, can also be remarkably responsive when senior leadership understands what needs to happen and trusts their subordinates to execute properly. The Ministry of Defense could have been rigid in enforcing its extraction order. The ministry could have refused the request without consideration. The ministry could have insisted on immediate extraction to maintain strict discipline and enforce predetermined timelines. But the ministry understood that military effectiveness sometimes requires flexibility. That responsiveness to tactical reality is sometimes more important than adherence to predetermined plans. The ministry understood that the SAS commander on the ground understood the tactical situation in nuanced ways that senior leadership couldn't fully understand from a distance in London. The ministry made a judgment that granting the request made operational sense. That judgment was correct. The 6 more hours resulted in better military outcomes than would have resulted if the extraction order had been rigidly enforced. The fundamental principle illustrated by ideal military command structures is that military institutions at their best maintain both structure and flexibility, both clear command authority and tactical freedom, both responsiveness to strategy and adaptability to tactical reality. These well-functioning institutions don't happen by accident. They result from conscious leadership decisions made over years, from institutional understanding about how military operations actually work, as opposed to how military theory says they should work, and from willingness to learn from previous conflicts and incorporate those lessons into practice. Military institutions that have learned that special operations forces need flexibility, that understand granting reasonable requests from tactical commanders results in better outcomes than does rigid enforcement of predetermined plans, demonstrate institutional maturity. The result is more effective military operations and accomplishment of objectives that maintain both structure and responsiveness to tactical reality. This principle continues to guide military operations across the world and across different military institutions. This is what it means when military institutions understand how to be both effective and responsive to real-world situations, by when they balance the need for hierarchy and structure against the need for flexibility and tactical adaptation. The evolution of military institutions in how they understand special operations forces represents a significant shift. Before the Falklands War, military institutions might have enforced extraction orders more rigidly. By the 1990s, the institutional understanding had evolved. Commanders felt empowered to request extensions when they had sound operational reasoning. Higher command understood that providing flexibility to tactical commanders resulted in better military outcomes. This shift from rigid enforcement to conditional flexibility reflects institutional learning from multiple conflicts. The result has been military operations more adaptive to real-world tactical situations. The institutional learning about special operations forces has evolved based on experience across multiple conflicts. The Falklands War demonstrated that special operations forces were most effective when given tactical flexibility. Subsequent conflicts reinforced this lesson. By the 1990s, it had become increasingly accepted wisdom that special operations forces needed operational freedom. By then, command relationships with special operations forces reflected this understanding. The principle of responding positively to well-reasoned requests from tactical commanders reflected more than a decade of institutional learning about how to command special operations forces effectively. The arc of SAS history, from the Falklands War through the 1990s, shows clear institutional evolution in how special operations forces are commanded and how military organizations balance authority with flexibility. In the Falklands, the SAS demonstrated the benefits of operational flexibility and quick decision-making, sometimes exceeding stated parameters, but achieving military objectives in ways that rigid adherence to predetermined plans couldn't have achieved. Over subsequent decades, military institutions developed more formal procedures for providing this flexibility, such as establishing protocols for how commanders could request extensions when operational reasoning warranted it, creating institutional mechanisms for communicating across levels of command when tactical situations required adjustment. By the 1990s, the framework involved both clear command relationships and tactical flexibility, both hierarchy and responsiveness. The principle remained consistent. Special operations forces operate most effectively within a structure that respects hierarchy and chain of command while allowing real-time tactical adaptation to circumstances that couldn't be anticipated in advance. The enduring lesson of the 6 more hours is that military institutions that understand special operations forces, that provide the kind of command environment that special operations forces need to be effective, that balance structure and flexibility, that trust their subordinates, that listen to requests from people on the ground, those institutions get better results. The Ministry of Defense's decision to grant the request for 6 more hours demonstrates this principle. Military institutions around the world have learned similar lessons. Military institutions continue to provide special operations forces with significant tactical freedom. Military institutions continue to listen to requests from tactical commanders for additional authority or additional time. Military institutions continue to understand that providing this kind of flexibility results in better military outcomes. The 6 more hours in Bosnia in 1994 was a moment when one military institution demonstrated that understanding. That moment continues to resonate through military operations across the world. In the broader narrative of SAS history and Special Operations Command more generally, the 6 more hours in Bosnia in 1994 stands as a symbol of military institutions learning and evolving across more than a decade. The Falklands War taught lessons about tactical freedom and the value of operational flexibility. Bosnia demonstrated how those lessons had been institutionalized into military practice, incorporated into military doctrine, and become accepted principles of how military institutions should operate. The SAS commander didn't have to fight for permission or exceed orders without authorization. The commander made a request, explained the operational rationale, and the request was granted. This difference between June 1982 in the Falklands and 1994 in Bosnia illustrates significant institutional evolution in how militaries understand command relationships with special operations forces. By 1994, military institutions had learned that special operations forces performed best when given the freedom to operate with tactical flexibility, and when provided flexibility within strategic parameters while maintaining clear lines of authority, when trusted to make real-time decisions based on tactical reality rather than predetermined plans. The decision to grant the 6 more hours reflects this matured understanding of how special operations forces should be commanded. The story of the 6 more hours also reminds us that military leadership, at its best, makes informed decisions about when to provide flexibility. Higher command didn't automatically grant the request. Higher command considered the request seriously. Higher command made a judgment about whether granting the request made operational sense. The decision to grant the request was based on understanding that the SAS commander was making an honest assessment of what could be accomplished in 6 additional hours, that the commander would use the time responsibly, that granting the request would result in better military outcomes. This is leadership based on understanding, on trust, on mature judgment about when flexibility is warranted. The 6 more hours in Bosnia in 1994 represents a moment when military institutions demonstrated that they had fully learned the lessons from the Falklands War and subsequent conflicts about how special operations forces should be commanded. The lessons had been incorporated into doctrine. The lessons had shaped how command relationships were structured. The lessons had influenced how military institutions responded to requests from tactical commanders. The 6 more hours was granted within this context of evolved institutional understanding. The decision to grant the request was made by military institutions that understood, based on years of experience across multiple conflicts, that providing flexibility to special operations forces resulted in better military outcomes. This understanding continues to guide military operations across the world today.